EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving homebuilders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's presentation is titled Maintenance by the Book, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. Mike holds a CFI certificate, an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization privileges. 2008, he was awarded the FAA Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year Award and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Thanks everybody for coming. And tonight's topic webinar is titled Maintenance by the Book with a question mark. And what we are going to be talking about tonight is what the FARs actually require with respect to doing maintenance in accordance with manufacturers' guidance, maintenance manuals, instructions for continuing airworthiness, service bulletins, that sort of thing. We're going to be talking about this in the context of certificated aircraft. Obviously, experimental amateur-built aircraft are permitted to be maintained pretty much any way the owner wants to maintain them, because most of the maintenance regulations that affect certificated aircraft don't apply to amateur-built aircraft. So the issue that I'm going to be talking about tonight is for certificated aircraft. What are the requirements in terms of following manufacturer's guidance? And let's see. Here we go. Mechanics are constantly telling owners that various things have to be done maintenance-wise because the manufacturer says they have to be done. A few examples that come up frequently: overhauling propellers every 6 years, something that both Macaulay and Hartzell put in their propeller TBOs. Overhauling magnetos every 4 years. I think both Slick and Continental Bendix mags, the manufacturers say that they should be overhauled every 4 years. Pretty much every model of Cessna, the manual says that the trim tab actuators need to be disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated every 200 hours. For some of the new Garmin autopilots, they have instructions for continued airworthiness that says that the servo clutches have to be checked for proper breakaway torque every annual inspection. One of the kind of famous ones is the Beech Bonanza, where Beech says that every 5 years the wing bolts that hold the wings onto the fuselage need to be removed and sent out for non-destructive testing, and then at a longer interval they're supposed to be replaced with new wing bolts. We've run into some situations with some of the Cirruses that we manage that have an STC oxygen system from a company called Precise Flight, and their instructions for continued airworthiness say that the regulator, the oxygen regulator, has to be sent out for overhaul every 5 years. So A&Ps tell aircraft owners that stuff like this needs to be done all the time, and most owners do consent to having the work done because they believe that it is indeed required. But we're going to take a look to see whether it really is required. In most cases, the mechanics who are giving the owners this advice believe that this work is required. Mechanics throughout their training are always taught that they have to do things strictly by the book. And most of them believe that they're required to do things by the book by the FAA. The truth is not quite that simple. So we're going to take a look at what the regs really require. And in fact, the FARs generally do not require manufacturer specified maintenance intervals and maintenance tasks and so on to be performed, even if the manufacturer says they need to be performed, even if the manufacturer says that it's mandatory for them to be performed. Now, in some cases, doing the stuff that the manufacturer calls for is good practice. In some cases, doing the stuff that the manufacturer calls for is a waste of time at best, and often a prescription for creating a problem where none previously existed at worst. Because anytime you take something apart, you always run the risk that it won't go together quite right, and you'll create a maintenance-induced failure. So we don't want to be doing maintenance unless there's a really good reason to do it. Mechanics are trained that a really good reason to do maintenance is because the manufacturer says to do it. But in fact, that's not what the regulations say. And the situation is quite confusing. It's not only aircraft owners that are confused about this. Mechanics are frequently confused about what maintenance is required or not required by regulation. And because the actual position of the FAA on this is until recently anyway, has not been set forth in any particular one easy to read place. There's a large body of FAA orders which are directed to FAA employees, but generally not read by mechanics. There's a large body of letters of interpretation that come out of the FAA Office of General Counsel, the rulemaking lawyers back in Washington, that clarify what the FAA's regulatory intent is, but very few mechanics have ever read any of these letters of interpretation. So they pretty much believe what they were taught in A&P school. And what they were taught in A&P school generally doesn't comport with what the FAA's policy actually is. Even the FAA employees at the FSDOs, well, they're not called FSDOs anymore. They just had a reorganization at the FAA, and the FSDOs, we're not exactly sure what they're called anymore, but we think they're called field offices. But in any case, you guys knew who I mean. Our FAA friendlies who are at the district offices, they often don't really understand how this works, because most of them were trained as A&P mechanics before they went to work for the FAA, and most of them have never read a lot of the literature that actually sets forth the FAA's position. But quite recently, I think it was just March, I believe, FAA headquarters issued a national policy notice directed to the employees at the FAA field offices to clarify what the FAA's position on this. It's a national policy notice. It's called N8900.410. I'll show you how to look it up on the internet if you're interested in reading it. And it was intended for FAA employees. Let's see. Yeah, it was issued March 31st, 17. And this is kind of what it looks like. And if you are interested in pulling it up, and it's really makes some pretty interesting reading. It's a 7-page document. And although it was intended for FAA employees, it actually is very interesting reading for mechanics and aircraft owners alike. So if you want to actually pull this thing up and read it, you can go online to fsims.faa.gov. FSIMS is Flight Standard Information Management System. That's the website where all the flight standards documents are. And if you go to fsims.faa.gov and in the search box, search for 8900.410, it will take you to this 7-page notice. I'm not going to go through the whole notice with you, but I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of what the notice says, and I'll try to translate it a little bit into English, because some of it's a little bit lawyerese. But it's pretty interesting, and it explains in a lot more detail than most people understand just what the FAA requires in terms of performing maintenance on certificated aircraft and complying with manufacturer's guidance. So let's start with some of the basics. Guidance from maintenance guidance from manufacturers comes in two basic flavors. There is how-to guidance and there's when-to guidance. How-to guidance is the guidance that provides the specific methods, techniques, and practices for performing a particular maintenance task, how to do something. And the maintenance manuals are full of how-to guidance. Following the how-to guidance of the manufacturer is the responsibility of the mechanic doing the work. Mechanics in our system are responsible for how maintenance is done. When-to guidance is the guidance that says when or how often a particular maintenance task is to be performed. Things like stuff that's supposed to be performed every 50 hours or 100 hours or at every annual inspection or every 5 years, that's when-to guidance. And responsibility for getting maintenance done at the proper intervals is the responsibility of the aircraft owner. So aircraft owners are responsible in our system for if and when to get maintenance done. And mechanics are responsible for how maintenance is to be done. And the regulatory guidance from the FAA is split up very clearly along those two lines. The how-to guidance is typically in Part 43, which speaks to mechanics. The when-to guidance is typically in Part 91, which speaks to aircraft owners. Manufacturers communicate this guidance, both the how-to stuff and the when-to stuff, in three different forms. In the form of maintenance manuals, in the form of instructions for continued airworthiness, and in the form of service bulletins. So we have two kinds of guidance and three kinds of documents in which that guidance is communicated by manufacturers. So now with that as background, let's see exactly what the FAR say about following manufacturer's guidance. And we need to look both at the regulations that govern mechanics in dealing with the how-to stuff, and the regulations that deal with aircraft owners in terms of the when-to stuff. So as far as the how-to stuff is concerned, the primary regulation is an FAR called 43.13. And 43.13 requires mechanics to follow the how-to guidance prescribed in the current manufacturer's maintenance manual or instructions for continuing airworthiness, or to follow other how-to guidance that is acceptable to the administrator. Now, most mechanics, when they read this reg, only read the first part. It says it requires mechanics to, what it actually says is follow the methods, techniques, and practices, but I call it how to, prescribed by the current manufacturer's maintenance manuals or ICAs. And then they stop reading. But it's the second part of this regulation that's actually particularly interesting, because the regulation also says that mechanics, alternatively are allowed to follow other how-to guidance, other methods, techniques, and practices that are acceptable to the administrator. Now, what does that mean? What kind of guidance is acceptable to the administrator? Well, I'll bet you if you ask your mechanic, he will not be able to answer that question. In fact, I bet you If you ask most FAA inspectors, they won't be able to answer that question. But that phrase is very, very important. And as you'll see, acceptable to the administrator does not mean approved by the administrator. It has a very, very different meaning. The best definition of this phrase, acceptable to the administrator, which is the phrase that appears in FAR 4313, comes from an FAA order 8900.1, which is a big, long order that governs how flight standards people are supposed to do their jobs. FAA orders are always directed to FAA employees. They're not documents that are intended for external consumption. They're the documents from FAA headquarters that tell the FAA troops what to do. And if you look in Volume 6, Section 14 of that particular order, you will find a definition of the phrase acceptable to the administrator in the context of what it means in terms of 4313. And here's exactly what it says in the order. It says the how-to instructions. And interestingly enough, the FAA actually used that phrase "how-to" right there in the order. The how-to instructions do not need to have any specific FAA acceptance or approval, as long as the person using them has a reasonable expectation that the FAA will find it acceptable for the purpose for which it was created, when and if the FAA reviews it. Very interesting. In other words, an alternate method may be acceptable to the administrator even if the FAA has never seen it. All that is required is a good faith belief by the mechanic who's using this alternative procedure that the FAA would not find it unacceptable if and when the FAA ever did look at it. So a procedure is acceptable to the administrator if it's a reasonable procedure. And to find it unacceptable, the FAA would have to show that it was not in compliance with some regulation. And the burden of proof to show it unacceptable would be on the FAA. So basically, any procedure that the mechanic finds to be reasonable and is not aware of any regulation that procedure would violate is, by the FAA's own definition, acceptable to the administrator, and it's allowed to be used. So the bottom line is that while most A&Ps will perform work doing the instructions provided by the manufacturer, because that's what they were taught to do in A&P school, they're not required by regulation to do that, as long as the alternative procedure that they use is reasonable. If the procedure is reasonable, then it's acceptable to the administrator because the mechanic has no good reason to believe that the FAA would find it unacceptable. Now, the one exception to all of this has to do with airworthiness limitations. There's another reg called 4316 that says that if the manufacturer's maintenance manual or instructions for continuing airworthiness contains an airworthiness limitation section, some do, some don't. But if there is an airworthiness limitation section, and in the maintenance manuals, that's usually Chapter 4, if there is one, then mechanics are required to follow any of that guidance in the airworthiness limitation section, not in the rest of the manual or not in the rest of the ICA. But if there is an airworthiness limitation section, if there's a section titled airworthiness limitations, then anything in that section has to be done exactly as the manufacturer sets it down. And alternative methods are not allowed in the case of airworthiness limitations. Now, airworthiness limitations mainly applies to recently designed aircraft like Cirruses and Columbias and Diamonds that were certified under Part 23. Legacy aircraft like the Cessna that I fly, or Bonanzas or Moonies, or the majority of the current GA fleet that were certified under the earlier regs, don't have any airworthiness limitations. And the Lycomings and Continentals and Franklin engines and so on that we fly behind normally don't have any airworthiness limitations either. But if there are airworthiness limitations, and that, as I say, primarily affects recently designed aircraft, then the stuff that's in airworthiness limitation sections have to be followed by the book exactly. Anything else in the manual, and most of the specified maintenance procedures are not airworthiness limitations, even if it's an aircraft that has airworthiness limitations. The majority of maintenance is described in typically in Chapter 5 of the manual, which is not the airworthiness limitation section, and those things are not required by regulation. Okay, so we've been talking about the how-tos, the stuff that applies to mechanics. Let's talk about the when-tos. That's the stuff that applies to aircraft owners. When-to guidance includes things like TBOs, mandatory replacement intervals, and other manufacturer guidance about how frequently maintenance tasks are to be performed. Change the oil every 50 hours, clean gap the spark plugs every 100 hours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every aircraft maintenance manual has a long laundry list of scheduled maintenance tasks. The maintenance manual for my Cessna 310 that I fly has more than 250 of them. It's important to understand that Part 91 operators, like most of us, are almost never never required to comply with any of those manufacturer-specified TBOs, replacement intervals, maintenance intervals, and so on. There's no reg that says we're not required to comply, but there's no reg that says we are. So in the absence of any regulation that requires owners to comply with those manufacturer-specified intervals, those when-tos, we're not required to do it. Again, sometimes it's a good idea, sometimes it's not a good idea, but it's up to the aircraft owner. It is not required by the FAA. Just because the manufacturer says you're supposed to do something every certain amount of hours, certain amount of months, whatever it is, doesn't mean you have to do it. All of those are mere suggestions on the part of the manufacturer, and it's the aircraft owner's decision when to do those things, or even whether to do those things at all. And again, there are two exceptions to this rule that aircraft owners don't have to pay any attention to the maintenance intervals that manufacturers specify. A maintenance interval that is mandated by an airworthiness directive has to be complied with, because now it's not coming from the manufacturer anymore. It's coming from the FAA. Manufacturer does not have the authority to dictate to an aircraft owner what maintenance to do on the aircraft, but the FAA does have that authority. So if the FAA issues an airworthiness directive, we have to follow it. The other exception has to do with airworthiness limitations. If the maintenance manual or instructions for continued airworthiness for an aircraft has an airworthiness limitation section, that section and that section only has been approved by the FAA and effectively is coming from the FAA. The rest of the manual is coming from the manufacturer. We don't have to pay any attention to what the manufacturer says in terms of when or if to do various kinds of maintenance tasks. But if there's an airworthiness limitation section, which there only will be if it's a recently designed aircraft, and there are time intervals prescribed in that airworthiness limitation section, then they have to be followed, because effectively they're like ADs. They're coming from the FAA, and we have to follow them. So those are the two exceptions to the general rule that says manufacturer prescribed when-tos do not have to be observed by aircraft owners. Also, it makes no difference, and the FAA says this in almost these exact words. It makes no difference if the manufacturer uses compulsory sounding words like mandatory or required or must or shall. No matter what adjectives the manufacturer uses in describing a maintenance task, you don't have to do it, because no manufacturer has the authority to compel you as an aircraft owner to perform any maintenance tasks that you don't want to perform. The FAA has that authority. Manufacturers don't have that authority. Now, it's important to understand that I'm not advising anybody to ignore all the manufacturer's guidance, because a lot of that guidance makes sense and is prudent. Manufacturers recommend that magnetos get a teardown inspection every 500 hours. That's a very, very good idea, because there isn't any other way to assess the condition of magneto other than to tear it down periodically. The magnetos have a lot of fragile parts in them, a lot of things made of plastic and so on that are prone to failure. And it gets very uncomfortable when a magneto fails. So if when the manufacturers say mags ought to be removed and torn down for an inspection every 500 hours, that's really good advice. Similarly, when the manufacturer says change the oil filter every 50 hours, that's really good advice. There's good reason for doing that. But an awful lot of the manufacturer's 1-2 guidance tends to be gross overkill for most owners, because a lot of that guidance is based on the worst case aircraft. And most of our aircraft are not worst case aircraft. For example, both Macaulay and Hartzell want their props to be overhauled every 6 years. Now, it might make sense to overhaul your propeller every 6 years if the aircraft is tied down outdoors in Tampa, a very high corrosion environment. But if that same aircraft was hangared in Denver, it would be crazy to be tearing that prop down every 6 years, because Denver is a very low corrosion environment. And if you're in a hangar in Denver, corrosion is pretty much going to be a non-issue. And that's the reason that manufacturers put a calendar time TBO on things, whether they're engines or propellers or whatever. So common sense says that you should take into account the way the airplane is used and the environment in which it lives in deciding how often to do maintenance. The manufacturer's guidance isn't like that. It's a one-size-fits-all recommendation. And again, it probably makes sense to follow that recommendation if you're on the worst case end of the scale. But if you're not, then it's probably overkill. And it probably is a waste of money to do it. And it's an invitation for maintenance-induced failures, because we don't like to tear things apart unless there's a really good reason to do it. The important thing to understand is it's the aircraft owner's decision whether or not to follow the manufacturer's 1-2 guidance. And if you decide not to figure out what your own guidance is, how often you want to overhaul your prop or overhaul your engine or do whatever the particular task involved is. Let me also urge you, don't get mad at your A&P for telling you that your mags are due for an overhaul or your prop is due for an overhaul, because most A&Ps believe that what the manufacturer says goes. That's what they were taught in A&P school. The regs are written in a way that could easily lead them to believe that if they didn't look carefully at it. And in fact, that's what I believed when I went through A&P training, until I learned that what I was taught was wrong. I've spent a lot of time reading this stuff. I spent a lot of time in DC talking to FAA lawyers about this stuff. I've I've corresponded with the FAA and requested letters of interpretation and so on. And so I know a lot more about what the FAA's position is in this regard than I did when I completed A&P training. But most mechanics don't get the opportunity to do that, and they pretty much believe what they were taught. And what they were taught was that maintenance must always be done by the book, and that's typically what most mechanics believe. So if your mechanic tells you that you need to do something, even if you know that you don't get mad at the mechanic. He's probably acting in good faith. But it is important to know what the rules are, and important to know that you have a lot of flexibility. The FAA gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of how the aircraft is maintained. So, Tim, that's all of the prepared material I have for tonight, and I'd be happy to open it up for questions.
Okay, Mike, thanks. Let's start off with this first one from Daniel. Daniel says, I assume this doesn't apply to SLSA. For example, it's my understanding that slide 37 would not be true for SLSA aircraft if Rotax were to issue a mandatory bulletin. I think the owner has to comply.
Well, that's a fascinating question, and let me just tell you what I know about that. The SLSA rule, which, if memory serves, is FAR 91-327. Is that right, Tim?
That is right. Yeah,
okay.
No, 91-327. Yep.
Not bad. Okay.
Real good. Yeah, good job.
It does appear to say that in the case of SLSAs, what the manufacturer says goes. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, let me single out one particular 91-327 issue and discuss it, and then I'll discuss it more generally. The one issue I want to single out has to do with whether the engine manufacturer's TBO has to be observed. And the reason that's kind of interesting is the SLSA rule came out, I think it was 2004, if memory serves. And Rotax powers 80% of all SLSAs, and Rotax sets the TBO on its 912 family of engines at presently 2,000 hours or 12 calendar years, whichever comes first. So the early SLSAs that were 2004, 2005, 2006 are coming up on their 12 years in 2016, 2017, like right about now. So the question of whether owners are required to overhaul those engines at 12 years has suddenly become a very important issue to SLSA owners. So I did a little bit of research and discovered that the FAA Office of General Counsel Rulemaking Division, Maintenance Department, AGC 210, has issued two different letters of interpretation in answer to two questions posed by people to the Office of General Counsel. If you're confused about what an FAR means, you write a letter to the Office of General Counsel Rulemaking Division in Washington, D.C., and they munch on it for a while, and after 4 or 5 months, they send you back an answer. And that answer is called a letter of interpretation. It's like an internal revenue ruling. It has the force of law. It's coming from the very top of the FAA, and it is the official position of the FAA. Well, I discovered, interestingly enough, that question about do I really have to overhaul my Rotax engine after 12 years on this SLSA has been asked of the Office of General Counsel a couple of times. And they issued two different letters of interpretation. They were spaced 2 years apart. They were written by two different lawyers, and they came to the diametrically opposite conclusions. One of the letters of interpretation said, no, you don't have to comply with a TBO, and the other one says, yes, you do. And they argued that case two different ways. Apparently, the two lawyers didn't confer with one another. And so I sat down with the lawyer at FAA headquarters who was actually responsible for all the SLSA stuff. And I said, A, this is an important question, and B, this is very embarrassing because the FAA now has answered this question twice, and they've given two completely opposite answers. One of those answers has to be wrong. And he said, write me a letter. And I wrote him a letter, and I basically pointed out the contradiction, and then I pointed out that I thought both of the letters of interpretation that the FAA issued were, hang on for just a minute here, were improperly reasoned, that they didn't have valid legal arguments, and he agreed with me. And I asked for a third letter of interpretation clarifying this issue and rescinding whichever of the previous letters was wrong. That was about 9 months ago, and I have not gotten an answer yet. So I'm continuing to pursue it, but I believe that any owner who decides not to overhaul his SLSA Rotax engine at 12 years is on firm ground, because there is a letter of interpretation from the FAA that says you don't have to do it, even though 91.327 seems to say you do have to do it. So that's the narrow answer to your question. Okay, the broader answer to your question, and this is the subject of another letter that I've written to the Office of General Counsel and that they haven't yet responded to, is that as a general proposition, it is my belief that the maintenance requirements of 91.327 are illegal, that they violate the Federal Administrative Procedure Act, which is the fundamental rules that govern not only the FAA but every agency of the executive branch of the government that issues regulations, of which the FAA is obviously one. And there are numerous FAA letters of interpretation that say that manufacturers cannot dictate maintenance requirements to aircraft owners, because to do that would be a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. And 91.327 appears to me on its face to violate the Administrative Procedures Act and to fly in the face of every other FAA letter of interpretation that's come out of the Office of General Counsel on this subject. So I'm pretty confident that if this were held up to legal scrutiny, that those provisions of 91.327 would have to be struck down. I'm trying to get the FAA to do that. This is a political hot potato that nobody really wants to touch, because no matter how it comes out, it's going to be extremely embarrassing to a lot of people. But anyway, that's what I can tell you on that subject. 91.327, I think, was very ill-conceived regulation, and I believe that it is actually not a valid regulation on its face. And my hope is that we can get those provisions rescinded so that the manufacturers do not have a chokehold on maintenance for SLSAs. They don't for certificated aircraft. There are very good reasons that they don't. They've been argued extensively by the FAA lawyers. It does not make sense that they should for SLSAs, and I would like to believe ultimately that that will be overturned. At the moment, the best I can say is that this is a very confusing area that nobody has a really good answer to. But we're pushing to get an answer. That was an awfully long answer to a question, Tim. I'm sorry, but
it's a complex subject, and it's open-ended.
Really,
yeah, a good narrative though of the background there. Thank you for that. We've had a couple questions of this similar tone, so I'll ask David's here. But David asks, how does one know if the when-to guidance is prudent or not to do? Does the average owner have the knowledge or experience to make this determination? Who can the owner consult with? The A&P will probably recommend doing the work.
Right, and A&Ps are almost obligated to recommend doing the work for a couple reasons. One is that that's what they were taught. But second, if they recommend anything other than what the manufacturer's guidance is, and something goes wrong and they get sued, they're going to have an awful lot of explaining to do. So you can pretty much bank on the fact that mechanics are always going to recommend following the manufacturer's guidance, because that's the way they minimize their legal liability. And if you were a mechanic, you'd do the same thing. But it's not the mechanic's call, it's the owner's call. It's important to understand that what the mechanic tells you is only a recommendation, just like what the manufacturer tells you is only a recommendation. How to make that decision? Well, the answer is that most aircraft owners probably aren't equipped to make those decisions without help. And so they should seek out the most qualified help they can get. And one good way of doing that is through your type club. If you are a Bonanza owner and your mechanic says, well, Beech is recommending that we pull your wing bolts every 5 years and send them out for NDT, and you want to make a decision as to whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, the place to go is the American Bonanza Society. They don't have a dog in the fight. They can answer the question, pretty much without bias. And if you ask the American Bonanza Society, they'll say, you're out of your mind if you let your mechanic pull those wing bolts every 5 years. Don't let him even touch them. But type clubs are a very good source of guidance, because almost every type club has access to people who are really, really smart in the maintenance of the particular type of aircraft. And because they're not actually the guy swinging wrenches on your aircraft, they're in a position to pretty much call them the way they see them without being worried that they're going to be opening themselves up for liability. My company does a lot of consulting. I answer lots of these questions about what do you think I should do. I do that sort of thing all the time. But obviously, if you ask the manufacturer, they're always going to say do it by the book. If you ask your mechanic, they're almost always going to say do it by the book because of liability considerations. So you need to ask an expert who is neither the manufacturer or your mechanic, but somebody else, in order to get good consulting information in terms of making your decisions.
Okay, well, that answer brings us then right into Terry's question. And Terry asks, if during an annual an aircraft owner chooses not to have an interval maintenance task prescribed by the manufacturer performed, can the IA refuse to sign off the annual? If so, what should an owner do?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's a theoretical answer and there's a practical answer. The theoretical answer is IAs can refuse to sign off an annual as airworthy for any old reason they want to, or for no particular good reason. IAs have a tremendous amount of discretion in this regard. The discretion that IAs have goes back to the basic definition of airworthiness, because when you take your aircraft to an IA for an annual inspection, what you're hiring to do is make a formal regulatory airworthiness determination of your aircraft. Is it airworthy or is it not airworthy? And for something to be airworthy, it has to meet two different sets of criteria. It has to, first of all, be in compliance with its type design, and it has to be in condition for safe operation. Compliance with type design is an objective standard. It always has to do with measuring something. So if the thing has Cleveland wheels and brakes, and the Cleveland manual says that the minimum thickness of the brake disc is, 0.183 inches, and the IA micrometers it and it's 0.172 inches, then that brake disc is unairworthy because it doesn't comply with its type design. It's an objective standard. But the other part of airworthiness, which is in condition for safe operation, is a totally subjective standard. It's the IA's opinion as to whether the aircraft is safe to fly. So for example, and this one comes up a lot, you bring your airplane in for an annual inspection, and the engine is at 175% of TBO, and the compressions all meet specs, and the filter is clean, and there isn't any objective reason for saying that engine is unairworthy. But the IA, this particular IA, who's been taught that you're supposed to overhaul engines at TBO, and who somehow believes in the TBO concept, which obviously don't, is really, really uncomfortable about signing off an aircraft with an engine at 175 hours or 175% of TBO. So what does he do? Well, that's a hard position for an IA to be in, because he wants to say your aircraft isn't airworthy and I can't sign it off unless you overhaul the engine. That's what he wants to do. But he doesn't have any objective basis for saying that, because he knows that Part 91 operators are not required to overhaul their engines at TBO. And, if it was at 120% of TBO, he'd probably be okay with it. But it's 175% of TBO, and he's really squirming. So what can he do? Well, he can try to jawbone you into overhauling your engine. I've seen a lot of IAs use scare tactics and say, if you don't overhaul your engine, you're going to fall out of the sky and die, which I don't think is a cricket thing, but I see it happen a lot. But if he can't persuade you to overhaul the engine, then he has to make a decision. He either has to sign your aircraft off as airworthy, which he really doesn't want to do, or he has to sign it off as unairworthy. And if he signs it off as unairworthy, he has to give you a piece of paper, what's called a 4311 discrepancy list, that explains why the aircraft is unairworthy, what about it is unairworthy. And so now he's got a real problem. What's he going to write on that piece of paper? Is he going to? He can't write on the piece of paper the aircraft's unairworthy because the engine is past TBO, because he knows that the FAA doesn't require Part 91 operators to overhaul a TBO. So if you push the guy to the limit and say, look, nothing you say is going to convince me to overhaul this engine. It's running good. It's not making metal. It's got good compressions. Everything about this engine is telling me it's still healthy. And I am not about to spend $30,000 to overhaul it, no matter what you say. So we're going to have to agree to disagree on this. Just go ahead and sign off my annual as unairworthy. I'm going to take it out of your shop. I'm going to bring it to somebody else who has his head screwed on right, who will sign off the engine as being airworthy. If you do that, most IAs are going to back down. And they're going to back down because there isn't any really good thing they can write on that 4311 discrepancy list. It's one thing for them to talk to you. It's another thing for them to write something down on a document with regulatory significance. Because if they write something ridiculous down, you could take that piece of paper and take it to the FSDO and get the mechanic in trouble. So I don't know if I've answered the question, because the question has a messy answer.
Sure.
But you do have to understand that annual inspections are pass-fail exams. No matter what happens, when you take an aircraft to an IA for an annual inspection, he has to sign it off. There's two ways he can sign it off: an airworthy sign-off or an unairworthy sign-off. If he gives you an airworthy sign-off, you go fly the airplane away. If he gives you an unairworthy sign-off, he has to explain what it was about your aircraft that prevented him from signing it off as airworthy. And so he has to come up with a reason that he's comfortable enough with, that he's actually willing to write it down.
So that leads into Robert's question here. Could a mechanic have you sign a release from liability when a disagreement over a maintenance manual item, when two criteria is not done?
Absolutely. The way that first of all, let's take this case we were just talking about of the engine that was over TBO, and the mechanic decides he's going to sign off the aircraft as unairworthy, and he writes something down on this piece of paper that says the engine is at 175% of TBO, and it's hasn't been overhauled for 27 years, and I'm not comfortable with that. I guess that's what he'd have to write down. Now, what the mechanic, if he's, what the mechanic should do is he should make two copies of that 4311 discrepancy list, sign and date them both, and then ask you as the aircraft owner to sign one copy of it for him to keep, acknowledging that you've received this and that you are aware that he considers the aircraft unairworthy. That way, if you decide to ignore him and go off and fly the airplane, kill himself, or kill yourself, then if he gets hauled into court, that signed piece of paper is his get-out-of-jail-free card. In general, anytime an aircraft owner declines to have maintenance done in accordance with the manufacturer's guidance to an extent that makes the mechanic uncomfortable from a liability standpoint, what the mechanic should do is write a letter to the owner that says the manufacturer recommends XYZ. I presented these recommendations to the owner, and he declined to have the work done, and you sign it and ask the aircraft owner to co-sign a copy and acknowledge that indeed you as the mechanic informed the owner of the manufacturer's guidance, and the owner informed you that he did not want to comply with that guidance. That's a very reasonable thing for the mechanic to do. And an aircraft owner who has a mechanic who asks him to sign such a acknowledgement should not hesitate to do so. It's simply putting the decision where it belongs. The decision belongs in the hands of the aircraft owner. That's what the regs say, and that's the way things ought to be. Mechanics can recommend to you what they think you should do, but you as an aircraft owner have the final say on what is done. And the proper way for mechanics to deal with their liability concerns is not to try to coerce you into doing something, but to simply make sure that there's a paper trail that shows that they informed you of what the manufacturer's guidance was and that you elected not to follow that guidance. That way everybody is in the clear.
Mm-hmm. And Barclay just has a comment here. All of the discussion regarding the legality of various rules is fine and dandy, but we're out here trying to stay alive by flying safe equipment.
Absolutely. And that's why I was stressing that I'm not saying that people should ignore manufacturer's guidance. I'm saying that people should understand that manufacturer's guidance is a recommendation, not a requirement, and that the aircraft owner is ultimately responsible for the maintenance of the aircraft and for making decisions as to what maintenance is done and when it is done. That's solely that's solely the responsibility of the aircraft owner, and that's where the responsibility belongs. That's where it is under the regs, and that's where it logically belongs, because it's the aircraft owner's fanny that's in the airplane. If the airplane crashes, it's not the mechanic that gets injured; it's the aircraft owner that gets injured, and the people he's carrying. So that's logically where the decision of how to maintain the aircraft belongs.
And John is wondering, where can an IA find a good, simple example of an ICA? Most of the online examples are far too complex.
Well, I don't know what you mean by a simple example of an ICA, but
what's ICA? Is that
instructions for continued airworthiness? Any STC'd item that was STC'd in the last, 20 or 25 years, part of the requirements of that STC was for the STC applicant to prepare instructions for continued airworthiness. So for just as an example, Concorde aircraft batteries or Teledyne Gill aircraft batteries have instructions for continued airworthiness with them. Plane power alternators, precise flight oxygen systems, pretty much anything that was STC'd in the last couple of decades has instructions for continued airworthiness, and they're almost all available online. So that's the easiest place to look for ICAs is to look at STC items.
Okay.
Whalen LED lighting products, which were all STC'd in recent times, all have instructions for continued airworthiness for them.
Okay. David's wondering if the manufacturer manual states do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to change a component. Can I, as an A&P, just do steps 1, 2, and 5 if I have a reasonable belief that steps 3 and 4 are not really required to replace the component, using the argument that doing the work complies with 43.13 and is a method acceptable to the administrator?
Well, I think the legal answer to that is yes. Or I mean, I guess I shouldn't say legal. The regulatory answer to that is yes. The other part of the answer is if you skip steps 3 and 4, and the airplane crashes, and you get hauled into court and somebody can prove that you omitted steps 3 and 4 and that your omission of steps 3 and 4 contributed to the accident, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. Okay, so you want to be pretty careful before you decide to omit steps 3 and 4. But if omitting steps 3 and 4 is reasonable because steps 3 and 4 are effectively accomplish nothing in the particular context in which you're doing the work, then I think you're certainly on firm regulatory ground to omit steps 3 and 4 and say you have a good faith belief that what you did was reasonable and that the administrator would find it acceptable if he ever looked at it, because he couldn't come up with any good reason that what you did was improper.
Okay, Mike is wondering, I never reuse a cotter pin. That was a rule at my A&P school around 1964. Is that a real rule?
Well, it's not a regulation. I would have to go look in AC 4313(1)B to see whether that's the big telephone directory sized advisory circular that provides acceptable methods, techniques, and practices that are things that effectively the administrator has predetermined to be acceptable. To see whether it talks about reusing cotter pins. I never reuse a cotter pin either, and to me, it's sort of common sense says that you should never reuse a cotter pin. Not to mention that we are all taught that way. But again, if I'll postulate a situation where you just put a wheel back on an airplane and you discover that you don't have a cotter pin, a new cotter pin of the appropriate size, and the aircraft owner says, I absolutely positively have to be out of here within an hour. It's, this is a matter of life and death. I'm taking the airplane no matter what. And you still have the old cotter pin that still looks in pretty good condition. Would you make an exception? Yeah, probably. I don't believe there's a regulation that says you never can reuse those things. It's just, it's best practices never to reuse cotter pins. It's best practices never to reuse elastomeric lock nuts and lots of other things.
William is wondering, do these regulations and interpretations apply equally to aircraft flown for rental or hire?
It depends on what regulations they're operating under. If they're typical rental aircraft that are in Part 91 operations, everything that I said applies. Yes. If they're aircraft that are being operated under Part 135 or Part 121 or something like that, which is typically not the case with rental aircraft, Part 135, Part 121 aircraft have much more stringent requirements. They have things called operation specifications. The 121 has a lot more complicated things than that. And so none of what I've said really is applicable to operations under Parts 135 or 121. But for Part 91, everything I said is valid. Whether the aircraft is used for rental or flight instruction or what other kinds of commercial Part 91 operations. But it's used for charter, that's a different story because that's 135.
Okay, Rick from Texas says, if a part of the hangar was blown onto the spinner and prop from Hurricane Harvey, so it sounds like he just lived through Hurricane Harvey and a hangar blew into a plane and struck the prop and spinner, is a prop strike inspection required since the aircraft and engine weren't in motion?
Well, the answer to that is quite clear. Both Lycoming and Continental have effectively identical guidance in that regard. And any event that causes the prop to be damaged to the point that it needs to come off and get sent to a prop shop for repair is a prop strike, whether or not the engine was in operation. So, if, the example I always use is the airplane's on a tie down and somebody backs a Volkswagen into the propeller and curls the blade. That is a prop strike, even though the airplane, the engine wasn't operating. It's definitely not a precondition of a prop strike that the engine be running.
Roger's asking if my Lycoming 0540 engine has one cylinder that has a 62/80 compression, and my IA says Lycoming says that's too low and needs to have the cylinder rebuilt. Is this nonsense?
Well, it is, because Lycoming, first of all, allows compressions down to 60/80. And second of all, the language that Lycoming uses in their service bulletin is what I would call squishy language, that says if the compressions are below that, the mechanic should consider pulling the cylinder. It doesn't say straight out that the cylinder must be removed. The general criteria for Lycomings is that anything below 60/80 is disqualifying. For Continentals, the number is much lower.
Gotcha. And Don's been doing research from 4313-1B, looks like section 7-38, locking or safetying of bolts. Lock or safety all bolts and or nuts, except self-locking nuts. Do not reuse cotter pins or safety wire.
Good. Okay.
There you go. A quote from 4313.
Again, 4313 is not regulatory, and just because 4313 says it doesn't make it a requirement, but that statement in 4313 certainly strongly suggests to me that reusing cotter pins is not acceptable to the administrator, because the administrator has spoken on the subject. Not in a regulatory way, but he said, he effectively has said, I find that unacceptable. Reusing of cotter pins unacceptable. That's how I would rephrase what 4313, that quote, just said.
Mm-hmm. After all, the title of that book is Acceptable Methods or Practices, Techniques, something like that, right? So that is acceptable.
It is important to understand that 4313 contains a whole lot of acceptable methods, techniques, and practices, but does not purport to contain all acceptable methods and techniques and practices. However, the statement that says cotter pins shall not be reused does seem like a pretty strong statement by the administrator that he finds reusing of cotter pins unacceptable. So I don't think, having read 4313, that a mechanic could say, I had a good faith belief that reusing that cotter pin would have been considered acceptable by the administrator if he ever took a look at it, because FAA administrators already spoken on that subject.
Right. A great statement you made about 4313 doesn't contain all acceptable methods. Okay, David's wondering, in medicine there is a standard called community standard that holds practitioners to the standard that other providers in the community would hold to. Is there a similar standard in aviation?
There isn't really. We really don't have that kind of standard in aviation. But having said that, there is a standard in tort law, in just general civil law, that says that if we're I'm gonna apply it to a mechanic. It says that a mechanic would be considered civilly negligent, and perhaps liable for damages if he either did something that a reasonable and prudent mechanic would not have done, or he failed to do something that a reasonable and prudent mechanic would have done. So then you have to establish in court what would a reasonable and prudent mechanic have done, and the way you do that is you get a whole bunch of mechanic experts to testify. Well, what would you have done in this situation? And you say, see, that's what a reasonable and prudent mechanic would have done, and this yo-yo didn't do it, or that's the way it works in terms of civil litigation. But there isn't any accepted standard. The standard is kind of redefined every time there's a lawsuit.
Robert's wondering, alterations with a 337 have instructions for continued airworthiness. Are these instructions mandatory even though the aircraft was not certificated under Part 23?
I think I lost the train of thought there, Tim. Would you read the question again?
Alterations with a 337 have instructions for continued airworthiness. Are these instructions mandatory even though the aircraft was not certificated under Part 23?
Okay, I need to unscramble that a little bit because it's sort of based on a false premise. So I'll try to address what I think the questioner actually meant. Instructions for continued airworthiness are never mandatory. The only thing that is mandatory is an airworthiness limitation section within within an instructions for continued airworthiness document. If the ICA has an airworthiness limitation section, then what is in that section and that section only is compulsory. The rest of it is a recommendation. And now to address the question, if you had a CAR-3 airplane, a Cessna 182, which has no instructions for continued airworthiness, and you installed an STC, let's say for a parachute, for a ballistic BRS parachute, and that STC has a real thick instructions for continued airworthiness for the parachute system, and a big part of that ICA is an airworthiness limitation section that says the rocket motor has to be repacked at 10 years and so on and so forth. And those would absolutely be compulsory. It has nothing to do with the fact that the 182 is a CAR-3 airplane that doesn't have any airworthiness limitations, but the STC has airworthiness limitations, and those airworthiness limitations act effectively like an AD. And yes, the airworthiness limitations section within an ICA of an STC'd item is always compulsory. The rest of the ICA is not compulsory. It's a recommendation.
Okay, and David's wondering if legacy Lycomings don't have airworthiness limitations for tightening connecting rod bolts, may an A&P then safely use an alternative procedure?
Again, the theoretical answer is yes. He could use an alternative procedure that he had good faith belief was acceptable to the administrator. Because rod bolt torque is so critical, because the rod bolts are the most highly stressed fastener in the whole engine, and because the consequences of not properly torquing one is so potentially catastrophic, I can't imagine a mechanic who would not follow the the guidance to the manufacturer's guidance to the letter on that one, because he would be opening himself up for all kinds of liability if that engine cratered, and it could be shown that he didn't follow the manufacturer's guidance. And this isn't, I'm not saying this from a regulatory standpoint. I'm not worried about the FAA busting him. I'm just saying if the engine blew up and he got hauled into court, it would be very, very hard to defend using something other than the manufacturer's guidance to tighten those rod bolts.
Richard's wondering if your opinion towards Service Bulletin 632 Bravo and the AD for it changed since you published your article on the subject.
Well, my opinion has only gotten more and more hostile about how this whole thing was handled. I don't know if we want to open that door right now. I published a very, very let us say, outspoken and angry blog post on the AOPA Opinion Leaders blog about that last week. Because
what did that Service Bulletin and AD refer to, Mike, for those that don't know?
Okay, 632B is the service bulletin that has to do with it was mandated by an emergency AD. And it had to do with the fact that for about a year, Lycoming was shipping connecting rod bushings, the bushings that go into the small end of the connecting rod and have the piston pin that go through them, that were not machined to proper specifications. And those bushings are press fit into the end of the connecting rod. And these non-conforming bushings, I guess is what they call them, they were too small. And they're outside diameter, and so they would migrate out of the connecting rods and have caused a number of catastrophic failures. And 632B, which is the service bulletin that was mandated by an emergency AD that came out only a little over a week ago, basically requires a large number of Lycoming engines to have all their cylinders pulled off and their rod bushings tested using a special press-out tool that applies side force on the bushings and the measured side force. And if that force is applied and the bushing moves, then the whole connecting rod has to be pulled off the engine and replaced with a new correct connecting rod assembly. This emergency AD was issued under what I consider to be very unsavory circumstances, in a way that we tend to. We intend to hold the FAA to account for what they did. I'm not saying that an AD wasn't warranted, because I think it absolutely was. But the way the FAA handled it, I think, was pretty disgraceful, and I was pretty vocal about that in my recent blog post on the AOPA Opinion Leaders blog.
Okay. Let's see here. Just a question from Gerald. He says he's a Canadian aircraft owner, and does the Transport Canada offer the same discretion regarding maintenance frequency as the FAA? Do you know?
I do not know the answer to that. My general understanding is that Transport Canada is more demanding in certain respects than the FAA in terms of those regulations, but I do not know the details, and I apologize for my ignorance.
Okay, Mike. Well, let's wrap it up here, and please take a moment and share any closing comments you would like to with the audience. On my clicker here, I showed probably about 475, I think, maybe even a little bit more, just under 500 people logged in tonight.
Wonderful. As always, I would invite any of you who haven't already done so to sign up for my monthly newsletter that I send out every month with typically devoted to various maintenance-oriented topics. You can sign up on our website at savvyaviation.com, or you can check a checkbox in the post-webinar survey that Tim is going to put up as soon as I stop talking. And either one of those two things will get you on the mailing list for the email newsletter. For those who haven't seen it, my first book called Manifesto, which is a book about my maintenance philosophy and some of the history and reasoning behind it, is available on Amazon. It's been out for about 3 years. I'm working on my second book right now that I'm trying to get completed in time for AirVenture of 2018. And that'll be a much bigger book on the subject of piston aircraft engines, and it looks like it's going to be probably 300 or 350 pages. So that's a work in process. And if you're interested in participating with me and being part of the development of this book, you might want to go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/SavvyAviator. Here are the next 3 webinars that we have lined up that take us through the end of the year. On this sort of a segue from our just discussion about that Lycoming AD, I am weekend after next week. I will be up in Massachusetts attending the second annual General Aviation Engine Summit that's being hosted by the FAA up there at the offices of what used to be the FAA Engine and Propeller Directorate before they just went through the reorganization and eliminated the functional directorates. But at any rate, it's all of the FAA engine guys are going to be meeting with people from industry, the various aircraft owner groups and type clubs and engine manufacturers and PMA parts distributors and so on. And we're going to be having a 2-day meeting up there. We had one in December 2015, and this is the second one. It turned out to be a little bit more than a year, but we're having our second meeting there. And so that's in the middle of this month. And then my next webinar, October 4th, I hope to put together a summary of what happened at that meeing and discuss my thoughts about what the FAA told us and what we told the FAA. And one of the things we're going to tell the FAA is how pleased we were with certain things they did with regard to engine ADs, like the recent thing with the Continental camshaft gear, and how unhappy we were with some other things that they did, like the Lycoming rod bushing emergency AD. And we're going to try to get some promises out of them to behave a little bit better in the future in terms of how they work with aircraft owners in developing airworthiness directives. November 1, I'm going to be doing a webinar that's a little off the beaten path here because it's not about maintenance, but it's some thoughts I have about single pilot IFR, something that I do a lot. I'm just about to launch tomorrow on a trip that takes me to Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Tennessee, Connecticut, Florida, and back home. And I will be doing all of that single pilot IFR. So we'll be talking a little bit about single pilot IFR and some of my thoughts on what we've learned over the years about what causes single pilot IFR problems and what we can do about them as to be better pilots. And on December 6th, I will be doing a webinar entitled Grand Theft Propeller. And it's a webinar that starts out talking about a recent incident that I got involved in where an aircraft owner brought an airplane in for an annual inspection that had a very corroded propeller, and the IA explained to him that he wasn't going to be able to sign off the annual unless he replaced the propeller, and the owner said, okay, but I want my old propeller back because I want to sell it on eBay. And the IA said, well, I can't let you do that. You'll go off and kill somebody. And so that story will start us down the path to exactly what the obligations of mechanics and aircraft owners are in situations like that. So that'll be the December webinar. And Tim, I guess that's all I have until October 4th.
That sounds great, Mike. Hey, when you get a chance, send me a brief description of single pilot IFR so I can get it into our schedule online.
I will do that.
Thank you so much, Mike. Continuing your series of webinars, most generous of you to volunteer your time to give us this information and your opinion. It's so much appreciated. Thank you very much. Good luck on your flight tomorrow. And to all the attendees who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for tuning in, taking time and sharing it with us, and hoping you're finding it useful to you to help you be a safer, better, and have more fun, take care of your aircraft in a more affordable way. Have a good night, everyone.
Night, everybody. Thanks for coming.